In the Middle Ages, death was a profoundly important and spiritually significant event. Funerals in medieval Spain featured dramatic displays of public weeping and sorrow, but one practice in particular favored by women up until the early 13th century. It's particularly strange to the eyes of modern observers. It is so bizarre such that a woman would scratch at her own face to the point of drawing blood. All in the name of mourning. Today we will discuss this bizarre practice of mourning in the Middle Ages. And we will try to grasp it from the perspective of the medieval era. As hard as it is to understand, death was very much at the center of life in the Middle Ages or medieval times. Because of this, people created strong beliefs around the way to prepare for death and the best traditions for honoring loved ones. Unlike modern times, Europeans in the Middle Ages didn't have access to technology and advanced medicine. In fact, they didn't have much medical intervention at all. Infant mortality, disease, famine, war, and common injuries were at the foundation of everyday life. People lived much shorter lives than they do now. While the average life expectancy in modern times is over 70 years, in the Middle Ages the average life expectancy was 30 years. The year is 1211, a place the Kingdom of Castile in modern-day Spain. King Alfonso VIII's son Prince Fernando has just died. Alfonso is inconsolable, and the whole kingdom goes into a state of mourning. Funerary services are held at the royal monastery near Burgos where the 22-year-old prince's body will be interred. Knights don sackcloth for hair shirts, the elderly sprinkle their heads with ashes, mourners gathered for the funerary rites weep publicly and display their grief with unreserved sorrow. According to historic accounts, Jewish women have been experts on grief through their ritual lament traditions. Given all available information, this practice was seen as a means of dealing with the profound sense of sadness that comes with loss and death. Viewed as a symbolic dance of death, the women's typical behavior of wailing, scratching their faces, stamping feet, and clapping hands may be construed as a means of collective purging the body and soul of grief. The king's daughter, Princess Berengaria, assumes the traditionally feminine role of chief mourner and caretaker of the dead. In taking on this role, Berengaria was performing a prestigious function of the royal family. She was in charge of the royal treasury and directed the affairs of the funeral. She also made a dramatic display of the family's grief, weeping openly over her brother's body. She may even have taken part in an age-old display of sorrow that was by now dying out in the Iberian Peninsula. At the funeral of Prince Fernando, virgins scratched at their cheeks to the point of drawing blood. This was a very old form of public mourning in Spain, dating back to the Visigoths if not earlier. Saint Isidore mentions the practice. He regarded the blood as evidence of the soul's anguish and associated its color with the purple clothing and flowers used at burials. The practice was not limited to widows and family members. Women are reported to have torn at their cheeks in clothing in 1134, during the funeral of one of Aragon's greatest kings, Alfonso the Battler, nor was the practice limited to Spain. Cheek rending was part of a larger Mediterranean mourning tradition. It stretched back to the ancient world. One medical treatise describes ointment used in Salerno to heal the cheeks of women after a funeral. And there were other occasions aside from funerals when women engaged in this practice. A woman who had been violated would scratch at her own face to the point of drawing blood. This physical sign, along with a formal allegation, prompted the community to investigate the matter and seek justice. Historian Heath Dillard elaborates. A medieval Castellan will tore her face when she suffered deep torment. And a victim of ravishment doubtless scratched her cheeks instinctively in reaction to the misfortune that had befallen her. A woman might nevertheless forego tearing her face to hide the dreadful fact, or to maintain that, although forcibly abducted, she had managed to escape without being violated. The veracity of a woman who accused a man but failed to claw her face was highly questionable, and, in the experience of townsmen, there might be grounds for dismissing her complaint. To modern observers, such standards of proof might seem bizarre, even unfair, but a graduate student, Rachel Q. Welsh of New York University, thinks that we should view such legal statutes as primarily practical in nature. During this period, scratched cheeks were so closely associated with the profound emotional turmoil in a woman that their presence was highly indicative that she'd suffered severe trauma. A rough equivalent might be the presence of PTSD. which for moderns tends to point to a subject having undergone some horrific ordeal. By the early 13th century, town authorities began to eliminate funerary extravagance and displays of extreme grief, including the practice of cheek scratching. And Zamora cheek rending was limited to widows' daughters and servants of the deceased. Soria permitted only widows to wear sackcloth and tear at their faces over a grave. Other women were allowed to weep and moan, but were prohibited from clawing at their faces. The law code of Alfonso X of Castile condemns excessive mourning and specifically denounces the scratching of cheeks. Moderns might look back on these dramatic displays of grief as forced or somehow insincere, but we should remember that medieval people had very different assumptions from our own ostentatious displays of sorrow at funerals, or commonplace throughout the world for many centuries. Such behavior must have seemed natural, instinctive even to period mourners. Where were cemeteries in the Middle Ages? Cemeteries were not hidden from view or enclosed within walls, they were social places, part of the town, even the setting for markets. People were known to drink and gamble there, medieval people loved playing dice, and most of all prostitutes plied their trades. Burial must not have been really deep, because there is also evidence that in Avignon when the Rhone flooded, bodies were unearthed and seen floating. The church preached that resurrection was spiritual, but most folks assumed that resurrection would be physical. When the plague arrived and there was no space for bodies in cemeteries, ossuaries were built with at least a couple of leg bones and the skull, so everyone would have a chance at a full reconstitution for resurrection. Cities laid bodies to rest in mass graves outside the town's walls. Anthropologists discovered some of the more extravagant caskets, noting how the dead were laid to rest with fine clothing and jewelry. While they couldn't take this with them to heaven or hell, it's still a sign of one's status. Like modern Christianity, people in medieval Europe worried about whether they would go to heaven or hell in the afterlife. The fate of one's soul relies on how one lived their life. Did they live free from sin? Or did they fall prey to earthly pleasures? However, this wasn't the only thing one's soul faced judgment on. In addition, medieval Christians considered the manner of someone's death. It was desirable to pass away from what was called a good death. A good death is one that's typically at home, surrounded by friends, family, and a priest. The priest administers the last rites and forgives the dying person of their sins. It was only once all these steps were completed that someone could have a good death and earn a chance to go to heaven. Otherwise, one might face a bad death. This was something to be feared. A bad death was when someone passed away unprepared. They didn't confess their sins or receive the last rites. This could earn the deceased a spot in purgatory or even hell. People on earth would pray for those trapped in purgatory or hell as a way to purify them of their sins. The Black Plague. It's impossible to talk about death in the Middle Ages without including the Black Plague. Between 1347 and 1351, the Black Plague, also known as the Black Death, ravaged Europe. With a death toll of 25 million, the careful funeral rites of before no longer were possible in the cities most devastated by this plague. During the Black Plague, mass graves became common due to the sheer number of bodies. People collected bodies of plague victims around town, stacking bodies on top of each other. There was no room for sacred traditions and customs amidst so much death. During this time, the last rites were not performed because nobody was willing or able to administer them to dying people. The Black Plague had huge consequences on the traditional funeral practices of the Middle Ages.